All right. Hello, everyone who has joined us in person and the large group joining us online through Zoom. Thanks so much for participating today. We're really excited for the third in our series of seminars on women's empowerment in development being run by the Women's Empowerment in Development Lab in partnership with the International Development Research Center and with some funding from SSHRC as well. So thanks to our partners for that. The topic of today's seminars is conditional cash transfers and women's economic empowerment. We have a wonderful panel here to speak to us on this, a panel of experts, as well as our facilitator, Sonia Laszlo. And with that, actually, I think I will just hand it over to Sonia. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm very excited to be giving this talk on cash transfers and women's economic empowerment. I know that cash transfers is something that we've been hearing a lot about in the development arena, but I just thought I'd start by just giving a very quick overview of the differences between conditional and unconditional cash transfers. What is it that we're really talking about? So I'll start with the unconditional cash transfer. We can think about this as an anti-poverty policy or program or social protection program, where essentially what we're dealing with is some sort of regular consumption or cash stipend that's provided to households. There are a large number of different cash transfer programs out there, but they generally have some sort of monthly or bi-monthly or even sometimes weekly frequency with which the stipend is given to the household. They are typically, but not always, given to the mother or to the female household head, and there are reasons for that I'll get to in a moment. And increasingly, they are being paired with other programs, and some of the programs in particular that are incorporating cash transfers within their programs are these graduation programs, which combine many different components like asset transfers and savings programs, along with other types of programs. Now, conditional cash transfers, very much the same as these unconditional cash transfers, but with the addition of these conditions, right? So conditions are normally, but not always, but almost always, a combination of making sure that children are not only enrolled in school, but attend a certain minimum number of classes or days in school, and also that households, in particular, children and pregnant mothers attend health services, children are immunized regularly, and that pregnant women continue with prenatal care. So these are the general ingredients that most cash transfer programs, whether they're unconditional or conditional. Where does this come from? Why are we talking about cash transfers? So we can go all the way back to the Millennium Development Goals, or we can look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Cash transfers, whether they're unconditional or conditional, they try to really respond to a number of core areas that we as a development community international view as priorities. So the first one is no poverty. Here we're talking about a cash transfer, so the idea here it is an anti-poverty policy, so it addresses that sustainable development goal immediately. Right, connected to that is the zero hunger. Clearly, income, consumption, and food consumption are very tightly linked, especially with vulnerable and poor populations. The fact that many of these cash transfer programs are actually conditional on education and health actually ties directly with these other two goals, good health and well-being, which is Sustainable Development Goal number 3, and then 4, which is quality education, and that's Sustainable Goal number 4. Right, and if you remember, very often, most but not all cash transfer programs target women. That also helps us address that 5th Sustainable Development Goal. So just in terms of big picture, if we think about a number of possible anti-poverty policies, here's one that can actually hit a lot of different targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. Just to sort of put it in context, this is nothing new, right? This notion of trying to resolve poverty by giving individuals who are poor money is not new. It is, however, of increasing popularity. This is not just an issue from the Global South. It's also an issue that countries like Canada, the United States, and very recently Finland and Netherlands have also experimented with. And in fact, you'll notice in the current discourse, both in Canada and in the United States, there have been conversations about a universal basic income, which very much looks like an unconditional cash transfer. This is nothing new. This is, however, something that has really taken off, starting probably in Mexico with its flagship program, Progresa, in its pilot phase, Oportunidades, which was its more scale-up phase, and Prospera, the last phase. And actually, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Progresa, that program has just been shut down. So the new government has decided to end Progresa or Oportunidades and Prospera, and so that's why there's a question mark now. They seem to be moving to a purely scholarship-based program. Brazil, of course, has one of the largest ones in terms of the number of beneficiaries, Bolsa Familia. Peru, Nicaragua, Red de Protección Social, Colombia, Familias en Acción. And so you can see that I've kind of clustered a number of them here that are in Latin America, because in Latin America, they've done something very interesting. These are nationally implemented programs, right? Whereas in many other places in the world, they tend to be smaller. They tend to be organized either by local NGOs. I know the World Bank has supported a number of these cash transfer programs. And so very somewhat famous one in particular is Unconditional. In Kenya, Give Directly. And of course, there's many small scale interventions throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them run by the World Bank, and actually our panelists are going to be talking about other types of cash transfer programs in sub-Saharan Africa today. So before really getting into the relationship between cash transfers and women's empowerment, what's the latest evidence? I think it's important to remind ourselves what is it about cash transfers, right? What's interesting about cash transfers? So the first thing is, of course, this is at the very basic core of it, it's income support for the most needy. Okay, there's a lot of implementation debates here. Should it be universal? Should we target the most needy? Should we target people who are perhaps vulnerable towards poverty? There is this question that we need to sort of think about collectively. This is perhaps something that a social planner or a program planner would be interested in. Conditional versus unconditional. There are reasons why we might want to consider those conditions, and perhaps there are reasons why we don't, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. There are a number of other interesting and important debates, and that has to do with, especially if we're considering the unconditional versus the conditional cash transfers. Unconditional, you don't have to check that people are complying with the conditions. Checking that people are complying with the conditions incurs some costs, right? And those costs are not minimal, especially when you're trying to go to scale. All right, so there are clearly some administrative costs to think about, but there are also incentive costs. And this is where perhaps some of the political economy is going to come in, right? Because if there is this notion that, well, if people get money for not doing anything, then what's the incentive for them to work? Right? And so this is a large part of the debate that has gone in since the beginning in terms of how to design these programs. And then I think very interesting recently is this increased attention to try to bundle cash transfer programs with other types of programs, such as we do see in the graduation programs, asset transfers, savings programs, and some form of mentorship and skills training. So there's a large debate, of course, on these issues within the economics literature. For those of you who don't know me, I am an economist, so I have been reading a lot about this. But the literature is not restricted to economics. I'm going to try to bring some non-economics literature into the evidence today. But this is, of course, these issues are even larger debate among politicians and also the public. In particular, if we take a look at how this universal basic income, again, a form of unconditional cash transfer. If we take a look at the debate that we've been having here in Canada, the United States, and Finland, that's just finished a pilot there. I mean, these are very pressing issues. Okay, the other thing to also note here from the beginning is that there is a lot of evidence of extremely positive effects of cash transfers on a number of well-being outcomes, right? If we think about children's education and health, the overwhelming evidence here is that cash transfers have actually, especially conditional cash transfers, have actually led to some real improvements in those outcome measures there. I'd like to talk a little bit about, this is a paper, a little dated, but still an excellent paper by a number of World Bank economists that have really tried to, I think, done a really good job at conceptualizing why cash transfers can be helpful. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract from that paper some of the important lessons, I think, for what we're going to be talking about today, which is the effect of cash transfers on women's outcomes and women's economic empowerment. So the first thing that they point out is that we can think about cash transfers to basically try to deal with two issues from a big picture policy perspective. One is redistribution, right? We have people who are poor and we have people who are not poor. And so maybe cash transfers is a way just to redistribute from the rich or the non-poor to the poor. So that's one. And the second thing, this is perhaps where my bias as an economist comes in, is that, well, maybe we can use cash transfers as a means to resolve some form of market failure. Okay. So what are the forms of market failures that we may need to think about here? So we can think about it in two ways. One is in terms of externalities. Okay? Externalities, this is when, you know, we're private actions are perhaps not fully capturing the impact of that action on other people. So it could be a positive externality, what I'm doing might actually benefit you, right? Or negative externality, what I'm doing might actually negatively impact you. And so here the notion is that, well, maybe for some reason, families are underinvesting in schooling and children's health for a number of possible reasons, right? Maybe they don't have the information, maybe they're just not aware of the returns to investing in schooling. And so maybe this cash transfer, if it's conditional on children going to school, can be a bit of a course correction so that we can induce households to do the more socially optimal thing, which is to invest more in their children's schooling and health. That's one issue. The other issue is around intra-household decision-making. Okay, that's DM is decision-making now, right? And the idea here is that there's a household that makes decisions over how to allocate resources across different types of goods. And the question here is who's making that decision within the household, right? Is it true that the parents are always making the best decision for the children, right? Is it true that the husband's always making the best decision for the children and the wife, right? It's not necessarily always clear that that's going to be the case. Right? So there could be these very interesting dynamics that are happening within the household where people's preferences aren't necessarily acted upon in a way that's necessarily best for the individuals within the household. So cash transfers can come in by dealing with those two issues. First of all, from the externality, if we make these cash transfers conditional on those goods which we believe households are underinvesting in for whatever reason, right? Well, then maybe we can nudge them to invest more in these things like education and health, right? On the other hand, in terms of this decision-making within the household, well, you know, there's a lot of evidence that shows that, you know, women aren't necessarily empowered in all of the domains that matter for intra-household decision-making. And so perhaps if we give the cash to the mother, then we will see that she'll have more bargaining power within the household, and therefore she can assert her preferences and she can be more protective of her children's well-being. Okay. All right, so that's kind of like big picture theoretical. And this is just another way of sort of visualizing that with pictograms and pure economics terms, right? So on the one hand, the fact that we're targeting women, right? The idea here is to directly empower them. Okay, this is big picture in theory what these programs can do. Conditional on children regularly attending school and health checks, we're directly targeting those other SDGs. So a few pros with this sort of design. These should, in theory, deal with some disincentive effects, right? The conditionality might actually be very helpful rather than being concerned that people are going to be spending this money on things that, you know, maybe we as donors or taxpayers aren't comfortable with them spending it on. At least they're sending their kids to school and going to health checks, right? And is therefore directly linked with those outcomes that donors and taxpayers care a lot about, right? I mean, we're hitting 4 one, two, three, actually 5 of these sustainable development goals that we as an international development community have prioritized, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Directly linked with outcomes that donors and taxpayers care about. The cons, of course, is on the one hand, for exactly the same reasons I just mentioned, these are often seen as paternalistic, right? We are imposing a sense that, look, households are not investing what we think they should be investing in schooling, so we have to nudge them, right? And so there's a sense that that's a paternalistic view. Conditional cash transfers are typically, as I mentioned earlier, much more administratively costly. And sometimes it can be quite suboptimal for households compared to unconditional cash transfers because the compliance costs can be quite expensive. And there's increasing qualitative evidence to show that just simply complying with having to get your health checks done regularly can be quite high, right? Especially if the health facility is very far and you have to line up for hours to actually see somebody. Okay. All right, so conditional cash transfers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both, but here conditional cash transfers, what they do is that they, it's immediate cash, so it deals with immediate consumption. It deals with increasing human capital investment. Sorry, that should be investment, not consumption. Actually, I kind of already said all of this. So I'm actually just going to skip through to the next slide. Yeah, okay, all right. So let me just try to bring it back into the context of women's economic empowerment and start to decompose that and unpack that into different components. Right, so on the one hand, if we're talking about conditional cash transfers or unconditional cash transfers, in both cases what this does, especially in most cases when they target women, it automatically increases women's income. Right? That's, I mean, very, very clear relationship here. So what it does is it provides women with at least the ability to access resources that they weren't able to do before receiving any sort of cash transfer. If we remember, for those of you who were here 2 seminars ago, where we were talking about the measurement of women's economic empowerment, or of course, you're probably very familiar, if you're familiar with this literature, with Kabir's conceptualization of women's economic empowerment, which is really this sort of theory of change that links resources and agency and achievements, right? So if we think about what a cash transfer, conditional or unconditional, does, is it automatically, you can already see that's going to impact resources. Right? But for that to really truly lead to women's economic empowerment, there are these 2 other boxes, right? What does this mean in terms of impacting her agency, and what does this mean in terms of impacting her achievements? Okay, so here, theoretically, there's a question mark. Okay. All right. So now I'd like to get into the world of what's the evidence, right? So basically, first we had the big picture policy, then we had, well, what does theory tell us to expect with these things? And now let's get into some of the evidence. So now the evidence on non-women's economic empowerment, I have a little bit in here as well about that, but most cash transfer programs, and in particular conditional cash transfer programs, have shown very strong and long-term impacts, not surprisingly, on those 2 things that the program conditions on, which is children's educational attainment and children's health and nutrition. Okay, the overwhelming body of literature all points to very strong results there. So this is really good, but it also shouldn't be surprising, especially with conditional cash transfer programs, because this is what's being conditioned on. All right. Given those concerns about, well, if you give people money for not working, they're not going to work, there's very little evidence to show that cash transfer programs are causing people to become lazy, right? That's just, it's in the discourse. We often hear it in the political domain. There is virtually no robust, consistent evidence that it is happening one way or another, okay? In terms of household consumption and nutrition, overall, the evidence here points to some very positive impacts. What's also extremely important, this is not so much the empowerment of women, but empowerment of future women, right, empowerment of girls, is that we see tremendous, overwhelming evidence that there's a reduction in adolescent fertility. And this is partly perhaps owing to the conditionality. If kids are supposed to stay in school longer, then in theory, that should be a little harder for them to, engage in early childbearing. right? So reduced adolescent fertility, delayed age at first sex, and marriage are also general trends that we see overwhelmingly in the literature. But what about women's economic empowerment? And so here I'm going to break it up into 4 different domains. I'm first going to talk about autonomy and decision-making within the household to try to link that closely to Kabir's concept of agency. I'll talk a little bit about some of the evidence on marital outcomes. I'll talk a little bit about some evidence on fertility, not fertility of the adolescent girls, because we know where that is, right? But I'm going to talk a little bit about fertility of the parents. And then I'll talk about intimate partner violence. All right, so in terms of autonomy and decision-making, what I'll do here is I'll talk a little bit about different case studies, right? It's impossible. The body of literature, right, on these issues is extremely large, right? It's impossible to do all of it justice. So I've just chosen a few of these papers to sort of highlight some of the results that we found. They're not unique results. Right? Okay, so there's a very interesting paper here, and I believe this was one of the ones that we suggested ahead of time for reading, Cash for Women's Empowerment, a Mixed Methods Evaluation of the Government of Zambia's Child Grant Program. All right, so here we're dealing with an unconditional cash transfer program, right? So no conditions here. They ran this as a randomized controlled trial in 3 rural districts. So this is not like Progressa or Bolsa Familia, which was a nationwide. This is a small scale experiment. Just to give you a sense of the monetary value of this, it's about $24 by monthly payment, which doesn't sound like much to us, but this is equivalent to 1 meal a day for all household members. Right, so this is not negligible, and I think it's something like 17 to 20% of the household budget. So this is a substantive cash injection into these households. What do they find? Right? Well, they find, and this is by no means unique to this study, but they find that this cash transfer leads to an increase in decisions over which the woman says that she has either sole or joint say over. So these are the types of questions that one would find in a survey. You know, who decides in your household about what to do with your income or your household income, or who decides what to cook for dinner, or who decides, on your children's education and all of that. So increasingly, they found that with the cash transfer, women were more likely to say that they either have sole decision or that they're making that decision jointly with their husband. Okay, so that's a very positive impact on her agency. Qualitatively, right, while they were also able to find evidence of this, they were also able to uncover that, well, at the same time that we're finding these quantitative results that seem to be going in this direction, that there are still issues around in transgender norms that might, dampen a little bit that impact. In terms of a conditional cash transfer program, there's also another very interesting mixed method paper by Lorena Alcazar and Maria Ballarin and Karen Espinosa. The first 2 are at Grade in Peru. And they've looked at the Peru cash transfer program Juntos, which is also nationally implemented here. So it's different than the previous one. National rollout. Here we're looking at $100 monthly payment. And what did they find? So they have same sorts of questions, right? Very similar questions as the previous ones. A lot of these are driven by DHS demographic health survey types of questions. And overall, they find that statistically, we see increases in economic decision within the household, right? They find that women report higher self-esteem, that women have more freedom of movement, and also have better perceptions of their lives. Okay. All right. So that's the positive, right? But there's nuance to this stuff. So part of the issue, and so this comes out of the Mexican case, there's this notion that, a woman will receive the cash transfer, that'll go into the household budget, and there's going to be some sort of fungibility in where that money goes, right? And as you can see from the headline in this story in the conversation, Mexican anti-poverty program targeting poor women may help men most study finds, right? So this is in one district or one area in Chiapas. And so here's a quote, I think that really gets to what that potential sort of nuance is. Prospera frees up time and money of its recipient husbands while increasing women's household responsibilities, reinforcing unequal gender dynamics within the family. Okay. This is also not a unique finding. Molina and Thompson write about this in the case of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and they find that in those three cases, that the cash transfer programs might have actually reinforced these traditional gender roles, especially around unpaid care and domestic work. All right, conditional, well, here in particular, we'll continue with the Mexican conditional cash transfer program. There's a really interesting paper by Gustavo Bubonis in the Economic Development and Cultural Change Journal from not too long ago. And here, what, there's this anecdote that we often hear, and when you talk to practitioners that are implementing these cash transfer programs, we hear about these terrible, conflicts at times, right? When the woman all of a sudden has more income, this creates conflict within the household, right? So what kind of evidence do we actually have of this? And so this is, to my knowledge, at least quantitatively, the first very rigorous study of the impact that cash transfers have had on what's happening within the marriage, right? And so here, theoretically, it could work in two ways, okay? The cash transfer could actually increase marriage dissolution, so it could actually lead to increases in divorce, either by increasing conflict, right? So maybe the relationship didn't have conflict before this change in bargaining power within the household, and now that there's this change in bargaining power within the household, there's conflict, and the marriage can't survive. Okay, so that's one possibility. The other possibility that gets written about quite a bit, especially from demographers and economists who are very interested in relationships and family, is that, well, it can actually improve economic independence. If a woman is financially unable to take care of herself without her husband, from a financial perspective, it's very difficult for her to exit a bad relationship. Whereas with the cash transfer, it may actually give her the opportunity to be financially independent if she were to leave the relationship. So on the one hand, it could actually increase divorce. On the other hand, it could even decrease divorce or marital conflict if the reason why a household was having conflict was because of income financial stress. You remove the financial stress, you remove the conflict, and so you would see a reduction. So theoretically, it's ambiguous. It could go both ways, right? And so here it really depends on the empirics. And so what do they find? They actually find, or what does he find, sorry, that there's actually no effect on marriage status, right? So if you were to compare women before and after, you see on average that they're equally likely to be in a married, married or cohabitating. However, what they do find, or what he does find, is that there was an increase in dissolution and new partners, right? So the marriage rates might have been the same, marriage cohabitating rates might have been the same, but there's a switch in partners, right? So this might actually not be a necessarily bad outcome if they're finding better matches. A paper that I looked at, also with the, or a paper that I wrote with a couple of co-authors on the conditional cash transfer program in Peru, we were interested in trying to debunk something that we hear a lot anecdotally, right? Well, if you give conditional cash transfers or cash transfers to families on the condition that they have kids, and if somehow you link that cash transfer to kids or the number of kids, you're going to induce people to have more babies, right? And in fact, very often, this is one of the reasons why politically cash transfer programs might actually run into resistance with taxpayers or donors. Well, there's actually very little evidence that fertility increases or decreases as a result of cash transfer programs. And as a result, we wanted to explore this a little bit more. And so looking at the Juntos case, we looked at the demographic health survey and from 2005 to 2017, and we actually found that the cash transfer recipients were more likely to use contraceptives in the long term. So this is already a good sign and something that goes against that sort of concern And second, we find that they're more likely to switch from traditional forms of birth control to modern forms of birth control, which are more effective. And very interestingly, we also find that conditional cash transfers are more likely to lead to women concealing the fact that they're using birth control from a husband that wants a larger family size than she does. Okay, so this we think is quite interesting because I think it partly speaks to the potential that cash transfers have in helping women assert their preferences within household decision making. But it also, I think, this issue of concealing birth control also goes to show that there are limits to which these cash transfers can really truly empower women to assert those, at least openly. Right. All right, and I guess another round of, or another domain that's received a tremendous amount of attention is the relationship that, or the possibility that conditional cash transfers actually leads to increased intimate partner violence. And so kind of echoing some of that literature from the marriage dissolution case that Gustavo Bobonis gave us earlier, theoretically, where could this go? So first of all, it could actually increase or decrease for the same reasons that it could increase or decrease marital dissolution. If it decreases financial stress within the household, there's going to be a lower risk of intimate partner violence. If it increases economic security for women, easier to exit the marriage, also lower risk of intimate partner violence. But if it increases conflict within the marriage, then you can see spousal backlash. And this is something that practitioners are extremely concerned about when bringing in conditional cash transfer programs, because we're concerned about a potential increase in the risk of IPVs. So there's this recent review paper, again, mixed method review of cash transfers and intimate partner violence in low and middle income countries. They look at, okay, what's the most rigorous evidence that we can find, right? We don't just want anecdotes. We want to see what the science has to say. We're going to look at quantitative studies and qualitative studies. By we, it's not me, it's the authors that are there. So they review 14 quantitative studies, 8 qualitative studies, and of those, they only find 2 studies that find either mixed or adverse impacts, okay? What that means is that the bulk of the high quality studies in this area are not able to find either, they're either showing that there's a reduction in intimate partner violence or that there's no effect at all. Okay? Really interesting paper, especially if you're interested in this. One of the main lessons learned there that I'm going to come back to shortly is the fact that, okay, well, what, you know, if we, and this I highlight here in terms of intimate partner violence, but we can also link that up to some of the others. What is it that makes it that perhaps this can actually, you know, the lower the risk can be stronger than the higher the risk, right? Because we have these opposing forces that are happening. And some of the lessons that come out of this is that you really do need to look at complementary activities, right? What does that mean? The cash transfer alone, right? Just giving the cash, that's not enough, because you could get that spousal backlash really quickly, right? You need to bring in a lot of community sensitization. You need to work with the husbands. You need to work with the boys. You need to work with the community members. You need to get everybody on board. So just to walk in, give cash to women and then leave could be problematic, right? It appears, and this is my reading of the intimate partner violence, but also more broadly, that these sorts of programs work best when not only are program officers, mentors working with the women, they're also working with the husbands to try to get everybody on board to understand why this is beneficial for the household. It doesn't have to be that zero-sum game. Before concluding, I think it's worthwhile also talking about this paper by Sarah Baird, Chris McIntosh, and Berke Osler, because it's really so I started talking about conditional versus unconditional cash transfers, and we talked about the differences in design, and there's a lot of these programs out there. Some, you know, what is it? Is it the cash that matters, or is it the condition? right? And I think this is a really very important piece that they've done. So they actually worked in Malawi. They ran an experiment where they actually kind of had both programs at the same time, right? They had so they ran this as a randomized controlled trial. They had one group of villages that were assigned to the unconditional cash transfer. They had another group that were assigned to the conditional cash transfer, and then they had a control, so that they could really compare, okay, well, what is it? Is it the cash that matters, or is it the condition? So what would we expect? So what are the effects of cash and the condition on outcome? So from school enrollment, attendance, and performance, we expect this to be positive, right? What are the effects of the cash and the condition on delaying marriage and childbearing, which is closer to what we're thinking about here in terms of women's economic empowerment, and something that they tried to answer with their experiment? Well, theoretically, certainly we would expect better adult labor market outcomes. We would expect better maternal and child health in particular. We would expect better marital outcomes, better match, lower divorce, lower intimate partner violence. Same reasons we were talking about earlier, more empowerment in household decision-making, and greater, aggregate economic growth. So they ran this as a randomized controlled trial in Malawi. They're targeting households with girls aged 13 to 22. And their target population here is really those individuals and households that are at risk of early dropout and teen pregnancy. Okay. So just again, to give you a sense of the magnitudes that we're talking about here, the conditional cash the conditional cash transfer treatment arm, they randomize the monthly transfer amount to the parent, right? So this goes to the parent. So between $4, $6, $8, and $10. Again, from our perspective here in Canada, this does not look like large sums of money, but there it's very, very salient. They also randomize a monthly transfer to the girl herself, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They top up with a school fee. Sorry, there's an extra word in there. They top up with a school fee. The idea here is that they want to try to minimize some of the costs of complying with the program. If you're going to require that these girls are going to go to school, well, you might actually have to compensate them for the cost of going to school. So tuition, books, and that sort of thing. And here they do a 2-year treatment, and the condition here is monthly attendance, which is at least 80% of days. The unconditional cash transfer treatment arm, it's exactly the same as the conditional one, except of course without the conditions. But they also gave the same top-up equivalent to the school fee, right? Because you have to still make these things comparable. What do they find? They find that the conditional cash transfer leads to an increase in enrollment and attendance among girls, right? But the effect on the unconditional cash transfer, the effect on school is actually quite small, right? So it seems that in terms of school attendance, it really seems to be that condition that matters. Again, this should not come to any surprise, right? So for schooling, they find that conditions matter. What they also find, though, is that poverty, of course, basically what this is saying is that poverty is a root cause of school dropout. Okay, so that's already confirming something that we probably already knew, but it's an important thing to keep very clear. What they find that's really interesting, though, is that the unconditional cash transfer delays child marriage or girl's marriage and delays her pregnancy. This is unconditional cash transfer. Okay, so even if it's not conditioned directly to the schooling, right, it goes to show that it can have some huge impacts on minimizing early marriage and early pregnancy, which, by the way, is also a reason why girls drop out of school, right? Why? Well, this seems to be, at least in the case of Malawi, and perhaps this is a context-specific issue that's probably by no means restricted to Malawi, but adolescent girls seem to transition from education to adulthood for no other reasons than for economic reasons. So where are we on the evidence here? So the results on women and girls, much more nuanced than just looking at what's happening to children's education and health and income of the household and consumption and nutrition of the household. So those results we saw were very clear and positive. The impacts on women and girls, much more nuanced. Okay, so if you recall, I kind of reproduced this thing here. We had question marks earlier. Now, the overwhelming evidence is that these impacts are actually quite positive. Okay, so that's very reassuring. But remember here, the key thing here is to remember that these results are nuanced. Okay, some concerns that we have to keep in mind with these sorts of programs. There is still this notion that these programs are seen as very paternalistic. Right, this is, you know, the development planner, the person implementing these programs. They're saying, listen, we don't think you're investing enough in your children's education. We might feel that we know better. Right, that's becoming a difficult position sometimes to have. Okay, and I think that that's one that needs to be addressed. There are also these questions about sustainability, and I'm going to get back to that in a couple of slides. But here, what do we want to think about? Remember, we've been talking a lot about conditional and unconditional cash transfers here. I mean, the conditionalities we know make it more palatable to donors and taxpayers. I mean, if you can show those SDG icons in your planning, it helps a lot, right? Look, you know, we're going to hit target 1 and target 2 and target 3 and target 4 and target 5, right? And how are we able to target all of those is by putting in those conditions. So that's not negligible from a big picture policymaking perspective. But of course, those conditionalities are hard, right? They're hard because they're expensive. They're expensive for beneficiaries. There's a lot, increasingly, of evidence that, especially in terms of meeting the requirement of regular health checks, this can be very costly for a very poor or ultra poor, extreme poor household that's very far and isolated from health centers. From the program delivery perspective, just targeting, making sure that you only get the poor and not the non-poor in your program, that's very costly, right? And making sure that people are actually complying with that, with those conditions, also very costly. Right, so that's something that needs to be, those are not small issues, right? There are these potential unintended negative effects on beneficiaries. I mean, the thought that something that you are doing to try to help people might actually lead a woman, just one, increasing her probability of intimate partner violence is something we all want to stay, you know, be very careful about. And then there are also these other issues that I didn't get into much here, but there is a large literature on, and they're generally bigger general equilibrium effects, right? If you are injecting cash within a poor community, this is bound to have potentially big impacts on local prices, right? And so it could actually have an impact, not just on the beneficiaries, right, through the fact that they get more income, but it could actually impact the prices of the goods and services that they purchase or the goods and services that they produce. Okay, and there are other examples. Again, cash transfer, very big literature. But I think something, and I know at least one of our panelists is going to speak to this issue. It's also this issue of measurement, right? So, okay, so overwhelmingly the evidence seems to be positive, but the evidence on women's economic empowerment and cash transfers is still, there's still nuance here. And there's still, you know, places where we see nil effects or zero effects, or it's just, you know, not as robust as we're seeing elsewhere. Is it because of these theoretical things, or say, okay, we've got these opposing factors that are happening? Or is it just because the measures that we have to pick up these things are just not precise enough? Maybe it's not, the issue might not be the program itself. The issue is how we're capturing change in women's economic empowerment. And I think part of the reason why I think we want to think about this a little bit more and to push on this a little bit more is you'll notice that, you know, I brought to this talk today a number of mixed methods papers, because the quantitative and the qualitative evidence here are often at odds. Right, and so that to me speaks to perhaps we need to really delve into how we're measuring and capturing these effects, because maybe this is this to me is just the fact that they're sometimes at odds suggests that there's a measurement story. So some lessons learned and moving forward, based on my reading of some of the more recent evidence on cash transfers and women's economic empowerment, to really truly be gender transformative, the lessons I'm getting from these papers, at least the papers that I've provided today, is that it might actually be best to complement them with additional services and complementary programs. And increasingly, this is what cash transfer programs are doing, and increasingly programs that are using cash transfers as one of its components, like graduation programs, are trying to do. Okay. It's clear, and here maybe this should have been a subheading rather than a separate one, is that we really do need to work with the men and the boys, right, to change those gender norms, right? Those concerns, if you remember that story coming out of Mexico about the entrenched gender norms and reinforcing traditional gender roles within the household, well, just the cash transfer is not going to do that, right? It's not going to change that. You need to also work with the men in the household, everybody, other women in the household, just to learn to share the burden of care, for instance. And then, of course, there are all these issues about how to address the political economy questions, right? So if we want to bring this up to scale, so many Latin American countries have done that. Other places are considering doing this. How do we do this? There are these general equilibrium effects. There are these potentially unintended effects. So we need to think about that. Importantly, right, who's going to pay for it? Right? As much as I keep telling my family that they have to find a tree that will grow money for us, the money has to come from somewhere, right? Money, unfortunately, doesn't grow on trees. The poor and vulnerable, of course, are often voiceless, right? And if they're the main beneficiaries, sometimes politically it's very difficult for them to advocate for themselves, to bring in these programs and to maintain these programs. And I guess this slide I put in today because I think it's worthwhile spending maybe a couple of minutes talking about the fact that Mexico has just canceled its conditional cash transfer program. Mexico was one of the most successful ones, right? Progresa, Oportunidades, Prospera. It was one of the, it's one of the most studied programs, partly because it was brought in as an experimental, in an experimental way. And so it gives analysts and researchers a great way to really, truly try to get rigorous evidence on the impacts of cash transfers. So I have actually here two, one from Development Pathways and an opinion piece from a Mexican newspaper. So for those of you who don't read Spanish, you should still probably figure out what it says. There's a Requiem for Progresa, Oportunidades, Prospera, right? Where the columnist is actually saying, well, part of the problem is the benefits of these cash transfer programs aren't sufficiently well known. Right, so that is what one of the lessons that comes out of one of his messages is that we haven't been doing enough to advertise the positive impacts that these programs can have. And he's saying this about the Mexican cash transfer program, which is probably the most famous one by a large margin, right? Meanwhile, this other story in Development Pathways actually points to this issue that I had in my previous slide, which is that the main beneficiaries of cash transfer programs, they're poor, they're vulnerable, they're often in isolated indigenous communities, they don't have a voice. Right? The people who have a voice are the taxpayers, the middle income classes, right? Who don't want to see their money spent in this way, right? And so you add to this all these layers of these, these myths about, oh, but this is going to make people lazy and it's going to cause women to have more babies and these girls are going to drop out of school so that they can collect their benefit earlier. There's no evidence of that. No rigorous evidence of that, right? So perhaps it's a combination of the two. Perhaps it's, there's this political economy story, plus the fact that somehow this knowledge that's been accumulated over the last 20 years on these impacts of cash transfers just hasn't made it down to where the political decisions are being made. Okay, great. So we're back. Hopefully everybody's got a fresh cup of coffee or a glass of water. I'm with a great pleasure. Very happy to have two panelists here who are going to tell us about really interesting experiences on the ground. Stephanie McBride from World University Services of Canada and Franck Rimard, a colleague of mine from McGill University, and also affiliated with the lab. Stephanie McBride is an education advisor at World University Service of Canada, WUSC. She has assumed a variety of roles at WUSC over the past 6 years, including management of the Kenya Equity and Education Project, which supports refugee girls' education. Prior to this, Stephanie worked with the UNDP in Zimbabwe. She has a master's in international development and is pursuing a master's in education. Franck Grimard is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at McGill University. He's been teaching economic development at the bachelor's, master's, and PhD levels for the last 25 years. His work on economic development has been published in the Journal of Development Economics, World Development, Economic Development and Cultural Change, the Review of Development Economics, and Ecological Economics. Professor Grimard is also the president of the Canadian Development Economics Study Group. And so what we've asked our panelists to do is we've prepared 3 questions for them. And so they'll take them each in turn. I've asked them to first describe their experience working with and implementing cash transfer programs, and especially if they could speak to the specific gender or women's economic empowerment context of these programs. And what were some of the challenges that you faced in your work in this area, if any, and how did you overcome them? So with that, I will ask Stephanie to start the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you for a very interesting presentation and contextualization of all of the discussions around cash transfers. So as Sonia, of course, mentioned, I am from World University Service of Canada, WUSC, and we work in kind of 3 areas: education, economic opportunities, and empowerment. I'm here today mostly to talk about our specific experience with the Kenya Equity and Education Project, KEEP. So KEEP is funded by the Girls Education Challenge, which is a big, as the name implies, girls education fund, funded by the government of the United Kingdom. And KEEP is the only initiative in that portfolio that focuses specifically on refugee contexts. So we are working in Kakuma refugee camp and Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya, and working with approximately 25,000 marginalized girls from both the refugee and the host community. And the focus of KEEP is really on 3 main pillars. There's kind of learning outcomes focus, there's transition focus, so grade to grade transition and keeping girls in school for as long as possible and helping them to transition successfully to the next life stage. And then sustainability. And under our sustainability pillar, we're talking about engagement with government to improve some systems, but also community engagement and long-term change, particularly in social norms around girls' education. So the age range of kind of the girls that we're focusing on are upper primary to secondary, so kind of adolescent and teenage girls, looking at that period of time when girls become most vulnerable to dropping out. And the cash transfer program that we are implementing through the second phase of KEEP is complemented by a lot of other initiatives in the program itself. So we also do kind of regular community mobilization through events. We have radio programming, we have film screenings, we do teacher training, we have a psychosocial counseling program for girls, life skills training, working with school management. So a variety of complementary initiatives that are kind of working on that whole ecosystem around cash transfers. So for us, we made the shift to cash transfers about a year ago. So in May 2018, we rolled out kind of our first pilot of cash transfers. Previously, in the first phase of KEEP, which was 4 years, it began in 2013, we were distributing goods directly. So uniforms, sanitary pads, solar lamps, focusing on some of the main challenges that girls were experiencing. And the poverty barriers to attending school. And in the second phase, we moved towards cash transfers, for a few reasons: reducing transaction costs, enhancing efficiency, and first and foremost, providing more autonomy to beneficiaries, and not prescribing to people what they needed, giving more choice. Our cash transfer program is conditional. It's a relatively soft condition. We target girls with low attendance who also meet some additional marginalization criteria. So for example, being from a female-headed household with a single parent or a child-headed household, if a member of the household has a disability, for example, those are some additional marginalization criteria that we take into account on kind of selecting who is eligible for these transfers. We distribute roughly 25 Canadian dollars per month during the school year. And we we mainly give to the mother, where girls might be over 18, because we do have many overage learners. We give to them directly. If not, it goes preferably to the mother. So currently 90% of the people receiving cash transfers within our program are women. So 10% men receiving transfers as part of the family. So, I mean, current state of empowerment and, you know, why we wanted to use the cash transfers in this context, as I said, largely the agency issue. We've been working in these environments in northern Kenya for many years now and have strong relationships with local organizations. We've really been focused the whole way throughout on community engagement, on promoting girls' education. And you know, we've seen a lot of positive changes. You know, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, we wouldn't have had, you know, as I experienced when I visited Dadaab a couple years ago, an imam who was speaking very, very passionately about the importance of sanitary wear for girls. And he spoke out in his community about this issue regularly. So we're seeing so many anecdotal stories of changes in attitudes, changes in the importance of girls' education and attitudes around that. So we have regular evaluations in our program, large-scale household surveys and in-school surveys to kind of get a sense of the pulse of the community on these issues. I mean, we have very high rates of support for, you know, the notion of girls' education. Of course, these are all subject to the normal biases that you get when you go to someone's door and ask them how they feel about an issue. But I mean, just as a few examples, you know, we've seen roughly 13% increase over the last few years in the proportion of people who believe that girls' education it has a significant impact on a girl's life. In a recent kind of radio survey, which is anonymous, we had 90% of people in Kakuma reporting that they were very strongly against early marriage. We see, I think, as we can all kind of anticipate, the highest rates of support for girls' education coming from women, coming from young people in the community, including young men. Of course, we still face a lot of the issues that I think we can all kind of anticipate in consultations and discussions with community members. We see that financial decisions are often still in the hands of men in the households. Our experience and our learning from the community has been that women are in charge of the household sphere and have an important influence on whether or not girls are able to attend school, because in essence, mothers or the female guardian in the household controls the distribution of household chores, whereas the father controls the initial decision of whether or not to enroll in school, because he holds the purse strings and that ability to pay school fees. So speaking of kind of some of the challenges that we faced in the cash transfers program, so as I mentioned, we've been delivering the cash transfers since May 2018. We started with a small pilot of almost 400 and kind of gradually scaling up from that point, and we're hoping to reach 2,500 households by this spring. So kind of rapidly scaling up now. Our challenges have been many and have been mostly operational, dealing with a lot of issues around what is known in Kenya as Know Your Customer legislation, identification and verification for refugee households has been extremely challenging. So the Know Your Customer legislation means that additional pieces of identification, such as a national ID card, need to be shown in order to get a bank account. And of course, refugee households do not have those pieces of identification. So through engagement with Equity Bank and with some other partners, we were able to delve into some of those issues with full participation from UNHCR. However, still running into a lot of challenges around verifying identities with UNHCR, getting clearance. There are often unclear records of households, so the information that we might have about one person who we want to select is not the same as the information UNHCR has. There are non-matching records, a lot of those challenges, and the financial mechanisms. So we are not a financial inclusion project, we're an education project. As I think we can all expect, financial inclusion has been one of the, not unanticipated, but one of the major externalities here. The vast majority of people that we worked with did not previously have a bank account, and many had no idea what the heck a bank card did or was supposed to do. Members of the host community who we gave transfers to have much more familiar with the concept from that side. The host community beneficiaries that we worked with, much more straightforward, but there was definitely a very steep learning curve for the refugee communities, which we anticipated, but maybe not the extent to which it would be a challenge. Clear communication, and I think a lot of studies of cash transfer programs I've read have shown this finding as well. It's very difficult to explain why you are doing what you are doing as the organization that's distributing a cash transfer. So, why is this family selected but not that family? Why does this family get $20 a month and that family got 21? Very suspicious. And of course, in kind of a closed community that is always talking, rumors are flying. If one person, it's a game of telephone. So maintaining really clear communication with beneficiaries has been a huge struggle there. So just very briefly on kind of how we overcame those challenges, we still are working away on them. Communication, I think, is one of the most critical ones, and one that we have kind of the most influence on, as opposed to trying to sort out the identification registers for UNHCR. But the clear communication challenge is obviously one that we can really work on. So we've been working on developing easier to understand, more comprehensive pamphlets and brochures and information explaining the cash transfer program, what it's about, why people are receiving certain things that others are not. And we have kind of a hotline and a grievance mechanism for people who are experiencing challenges. And we're continuing to work with Equity Bank and to address some of these challenges around identification, and also expanding the number of mechanisms that we distribute through. So not only going with bank cards, but also expanding the M-Pesa mobile money transfer options as a mechanism, which previously was not open to refugee beneficiaries, but we're expanding that option for host communities and seeing if we can kind of move that forward with our refugee community beneficiaries as well. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for sharing the experiences of doing this hands-on and some of the challenges, especially working with refugee communities. I mean, these issues of getting people's identity and documentation, it can be such a, such a stumbling block, but yet it's something that we often take for granted. Frank.
All right, so thank you, Sonia. So what I thought I would talk today is the very different program than the one that was mentioned. This actually is the case of TASAF in Tanzania, which is the Tanzanian Social Action Fund. It's a conditional cash transfer program that actually been implemented and has been scaled up in Tanzania. Of course, way back then, there were pilot projects and so on and so forth that led to this. But this one here is a case where now the project targets around 12 million people in the country. So, a lot of the things. But as the audience will find out, is that the same issues about targeting and issues about people complaining and information, all this are throughout the program. And it's just that I personally did not have to deal with it. The government had to deal with that. So we'll discuss this. So I thought before what I would do is to answer the question that Sonia has asked, I'll first give an introduction of the project. And then I will discuss the results eventually, and is it true that the cash transfers lead to more empowerment or not? And as a hint here, you see that the answer is that it's a complex story. All right, it's like I think someone down south says, "Who knew healthcare would be that complicated?" Women empowerment is complicated anywhere, and particularly in Tanzania. So we'll try to see that. So, but that doesn't mean you cannot do anything, and we can do things. But you have to be careful, and you have expectations that need to be correct. So, so the project that I was part of is a project that was funded by IDRC under the Grow Research Initiative. And I was working with a formidable researcher in Tanzania. Her name was Flora Miamba, and she was working for a think tank based in Dar es Salaam called RIPOA. And the objective of the study that we had was to explore the extent to which conditional cash transfer, which was under the Tanzania Social Action Fund, TASAF, would enhance the woman's autonomy and power to make decision empowerment, all right? And so the TASAF is, as Sonia described, like any other CCT, that is, there's cash transfers, and there's some of the conditions are on schooling and health conditions. Approximately about every month, 60,000 shillings would be given to a household, depending on the number of kids and everything else, the number could change. 60,000 shillings, $1 Canadian is about 1,600 Tanzanian shillings. So we're thinking about $20 to $30, $40 maybe. An average income is about 80 to 100,000 shillings a month. All right, so just to give you a notice of that. The project is means tested, which means that the government comes in, tries to, in the communities, tries to look at who's very, very poor and who's not, and does community testing, and then decides that these individuals, these households will get the transfer and those will not, right? Because obviously that's a political process. Sometimes it comes in with discussions back and forth between the central government as well as the local authorities. So that's a cash transfer program. And then of course there's the issue about empowerment. How would we measure that? And so we use the methodology that was developed under the guidance of the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, as well as researchers from Cornell. And it's called the Women Empowerment in Agricultural Index, or WEA. So that's how we're going to measure empowerment and trying to do in this, all right? So the WEA measures empowerment through 5 dimensions or 5 domains: production, resource, income, leadership, and time. So it's a very aggregate thing that tries to measure that. And so why do we want to do this? Well, we want to measure empowerment and try to measure it in an explicit way and also in a comprehensive way. And that's kind of a cool thing to do, but it leads to some of the issues about how do you define it properly and which domain is more important than others, and trying to do that. So the methodology is that is the following. So the TASAF started in 2015. The TASAF scale up of the project. So it's the official name is PSSN for safety nets. So, all right. And so we will survey households in 2015. And some of these households will receive the treatment, that is, receive the TASAF. And then we will observe them after 18 to 22 months. We will also observe control households in 2015, and we will also observe them around the same period as this. And what we do is we'll then look at the progression through time, and we'll look at the differences between the treated households versus the controlled households. All right? So that's a very much of an RC, or randomized controlled trials, an RCT. They're trying to do it, and we'll look at the differences in the differences. All right. But our method uses both the quantitative methods as well as the qualitative methods. So that's what Sonia was talking about, these mixed methods of evaluation. This is what we were doing. And the question is, to what extent do conditional cash transfers will empower women? Empowered being defined the way the WEA index does it, right? So there's a quantitative approach that we do, and there's questionnaires. This is kind of a very cool thing. If you want to do research, you can look at that. So there's a household questionnaire, there's an individual questionnaire, and you ask these questions. So we have about 2,000 households, so 1,935 households. We ask the questions, and we have about 102 villages that are from the TASAF program, and those that are made up of the old pilot program of back to 2012. And each village is about 15 to 18 households where you're trying to do this, all right? And so this is where we're going to first do a baseline, and then we do an end line, and we'll compare that. And next to this, we do a qualitative approach, where every time in the baseline as well as the end line, we do in-depth interviews with both men and women, about 120 of them, and then we do focus group discussions, and then we do stakeholder discussions. So the idea is that the quantitative approach explains whether there is a difference or not, and the qualitative approach is trying to tell us why, if there is anything. All right, we're trying to do it. So that's the idea. So if you want to see the picture, this is Tanzania. All right, this is with the various districts. The darker districts is where we actually our household, our villages, and where our households are. All right. So think about this then being the obviously TASAF is being expanded throughout the country, and this is where we go and survey this, and then we'll survey them in 2015, and we survey them again in 2017, and we look at the difference and try to do that. So this is the methodology for those of you who are interested trying to do it. So this methodology says that empowerment is defined according to 5 domains. One of them is production, one of them is resource, one of them is income, it's leadership, and then time. And then within each of these domains, there's a series of questions that one will ask individuals. For instance, within production, one will ask about input in productive decisions, autonomies in production. And then the domain of resources will ask questions about who owns the asset, who has controls over these assets, and so on. So this is quite a very much so. And what will happen is that we'll create an index of empowerment. And this index of empowerment can be created at the country level to let us know how empowered are women in Tanzania. And you can also look at it at an individual level. So for those of you who may perhaps look at poverty before, you could look at a poverty index, would be the headcount ratio, which is the percentage of individuals below the poverty line, and you get a number between 0 and 1. Say you get 40%. I would say 40% of the populations are below the poverty line. So the WEA index is going to give you a number between 0 and 1. 0 will say the women are not empowered at all, and 1 will say they're much empowered. Right? Everyone's empowered. All the women are empowered. And so we will get, on average, a number like this. But we can also know the contribution of each individual person, woman, to that index and try to do it. So this is what we're going to try to do. Now, the challenges in doing this were manifold. One of them is to get a research team going and doing this. And then, of course, thanks to the RDRC and the group research project that was facilitated that. It was a Tanzania-based research. My work in there was mostly support and trying to do with knowledge and capacity building, trying to do it. The other challenge was to do this alongside the government and alongside the other organizations that are doing impact evaluation on that thing. And one of them was the World Bank. So we initially thought, for instance, that we would do the sampling with the World Bank data set that's also doing, but the World Bank did not want to deal with individual researchers from Tanzania. They told us to get lost. And then one of the challenges then would be to still be part of this. And of course, formidable thing that happened is that given that Flora Miamba, my colleague, had worked before with TASAF, she was able to work out with TASAF a new sampling frames, working with the government, and so on. And also the fact that initially they had been a program with TASAF or pilot projects over the last previously 10 years. So Flora had developed a very good relationship with TASAF and trying to do it. So she was able to obtain all of that. And also the individuals in TASAF, the directors and everything else, were truly interested in the issue of empowering women. So it was not the main thing. The idea was to use a conditional cash transfer to alleviate poverty. But the issue of women empowerment was something that they were truly interested in. They wanted to know. But they were not interested enough to have some specific programs on women empowerment. They were just wanting to know for cash transfers and everything else. So that's how it was set up, trying to do it. So, and then of course the issues is to go in the field, do the study, track the data, going back to the field, trying to do it, and then the deals with then the issues that have to do with the fact that among the public, there were a lot of people who were in favor of that program and other people who were not. So we had to deal with that and trying to do it. So, but I'll tell you more about the results later on.
Great. Thank you. So it's interesting because, you know, we have two completely different perspectives, especially in terms of the challenges, right? Stephanie was talking a lot about, you know, challenges on the ground, on the beneficiary side, from the implementation side, and Frank was talking a lot about the challenges of doing the research around this, right? But ultimately, one of the commonalities that I see is also really, as I think, Stephanie, you put it, that the issues were mostly operational, right? And in some sense, I think that is also very much echoed in what you were saying. So we'll move to our next question. Our next question now then is, what are your findings? What did you find? We're going to start with Frank here. In the case of Tanzania, did the cash transfer program, did TASAF empower women?
All right. So the answer is, I said, complex. So I'm going to first show you numbers from the baseline, some ideas from the baseline. And what do we know from the end line that is in 2017? You'll see we're only starting to get some numbers of that. And the numbers are very mixed. So let me show you that. But understanding the baseline is important because you can then make sense of some of the results after. So let's try to do that. So what did I say about the baseline, or the WEA, the Women Empowerment in Agriculture, Women Empowerment in Agriculture Index? Sorry. So, and that was a number between 0 and 1. So at baseline, that is with the data in 2015, with out of our 1,900 also households overall, we find that the score is 0.83. If you remember, 1 meant full empowerment, 0 meant no empowerment. So you're in between, or closer to 1 if you want. So actually, what does that say? It looks that given that index and the various sub-indices definitions you're making, women are generally empowered, certainly compared to Ghana a little more, and quite similar to Uganda, right? So that was something. Now, if you were able to disentangle some of the different districts that we were seeing, some of you know Tanzania, notice from the graph, that the lower island of Zanzibar was actually included in our survey. And Zanzibar, of course, has a different ethnic and religious background than the rest of Tanzania. So if you do just the count of the WEA for Zanzibar, you actually find that it's a slightly lower than mainland, right? But what's more, I think, interesting from the baseline is that what I can do is I can look at the contribution of each of the 5 different domains of the index to look at the lack of empowerment in Tanzania. Right? If you remember, the domains are production, resource, leadership, time, and resources. Right? And so what we know from the baseline is that, in fact, yeah, domain is important. I mean, really, the lack of empowerment only represents 8.5% overall. Income, only 4%. Right? So issues about income, only 4%. But the real constraints that are hindering empowerment have to do with control over resources, leadership questions, and time. All right, so that's what it says. So this, what does that mean? The slide says here is that to raise empowerment, we need to pay attention to issues regarding resources, leadership, and time constraints. Right. So what does TASAF do, by the way? It gives cash. That's the only thing it gives. It doesn't do anything else. But I'm finding that already at baseline, income is maybe not the most sticking point in terms of making decisions, right? So just to say that as a warning sign. So now, qualitative findings. Remember, I had a quantitative things, but also I have a qualitative stories. And then what we did is that we parallel our studies of the qualitative findings along with the quantitative ones. So we asked the same questions on the 5 domains using the index. We also asked participants to define empowerment. And we also explore the questions of culture, legal, regional aspects as trying to do it. So that's this, and what I'm showing you there and flipping things, these are some of the quotes from these individual questionnaires that were filled and or focus group decisions. So productions here is that, were made jointly, about 50%, all right? But not what to do with the produce. So there is some process of discussions, but overall in terms of what to produce, but the decision of what to do with the produce is mostly now a male thing, all right? That's on the production side.
So just a question.
Yep.
You mean like commercialize?
I'm
sorry.
Press the button. Yep.
Just the question to clarify, not what to do with the produce. You mean like in terms of commercializing?
It's both
or sharing the
commercializing, but
benefit?
also what can they do within the household. It's both.
Oh, okay.
All right. So thanks for asking that question. There are also issues such as constraints, like in a marriage, land belongs to a man, girl cannot. Right. So people will tell you these things. And the time people will say women's carrying role in the home was a barrier to having time engaged in productivities, right? So again, that's what you get from the interviews. In terms of resources, women did not have full autonomy, but they have joint decision making. So that's why it's in terms of that. It still has some implications for resources. In terms of the income, a lot of decisions were made jointly. So if you define being empowered as that at least jointly, as opposed to only that, then of course I would say you're empowered in terms of that. So some of these discussions taking place. Leaderships are also very, very good things, but both men and women are active. But the males are often more valued in terms of their positions. So a few felt in their communities perceived women being in leadership was a bad thing, right? So very few of them. So in terms of time use, women felt constraints, and most of the people who were not constrained, in fact, were single women, of course, which of course is obvious, right? So if your survey does not find that, there's something wrong with the survey, but we did find that, right? So the also interesting questions that we do is, of course, we define empowerment with respect to the WEA index, but we also ask people how they define empowerment. And it goes all the way. Some of the questions, some of the answers go along with the Nabil Kabir Empowerment Agency and so on and so forth. And then we also have some of the interesting answers, such as the last one on this slide. All right. What is empowerment? Well, this woman says, is when women are well taken care of by men and their husband. So it's a different context, right? Let's try to do it. So, all right. So we also ask questions about the role of culture, legal, religions, and obviously Tanzania and in different districts, you can see that this is quite heavy. And sometimes, all right, this is how we taught by our parents. Women are expected to respect their husbands. Our families teach us to obey our husbands, blah, blah, blah. You get a lot of some of these answers of trying to do it. So now whether cash that you're giving over a period of 18 months will change this may not work, all right? So the hints from the baseline basically saying that, income might result to more power, yes, but relatively speaking, we have some empowerment. We need to seem to be needed time dimensions and leadership dimensions are important. So to the extent that conditional cash transfer might do something in this, might do it. But if the program, the treatment is only cash, this might not work. I'm trying to do it. And the same thing here for resource domains. The ownership of purchase, the ownership of assets, the sales of assets, the access to credit, if they are a function of access to land and so on, and the laws are for males and not females, then there's going to be some issues, obviously, trying to do it. So more needs to be done, all right? And then, of course, here, some of the issues that, arise from being married, this issue here about fungibility resorts from this. And for those of you who are not economists, fungibility means that, budget constraints are flexible. If the male sees that that his wife is getting some money, then he will just give the wife less money. That's what we mean by fungibility, and there's some of that. Now, so these quotes here are not for everyone, they're just select quotes, but this just to say that some of these issues are facing, and I'm sure in Kenya and WUSC, if you're facing some of the same type of questions to do with. So now, quickly, the preliminary results using the end-line data. Colleagues at REPOA, the think tank based in Dar es Salaam, they have found, this is something from about a few months ago, right? That looking at some of the indicators of decisions of productions, right? What did they find? They find no significant effects of getting the TASAF programs on the decisions. What does that mean? Is that the treatment women or the treatment household do not claim they're a big difference from the control households, right? So statistically speaking, the difference is positive, but the difference is not significant. All right, so that's what they're finding. So this would say, that obviously statistically speaking, we're not finding an impact on women empowerment. And I'll discuss later on about what could be some of these issues in terms of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephanie, very curious to see what you guys find in Kenya.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks, Frank. As Frank said, I think we can pretty much always determine that the findings are complex. That will be a surprise to no one in development or academia. So just a very quick note on methodology. So as I mentioned before, we started delivering our cash transfers in May 2018, and we started with kind of a small pilot, almost 400 households. So the assessment was conducted between June and October, so very shortly after the cash transfers were rolled out. So we're still, grappling with some of those operational challenges. This is not a randomized control trial. This was a very qualitative assessment, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, hearing that feedback from our local partner, Windle International Kenya, and from our teams in the field and our contacts. So with that quick caveat, so key findings, I think overall, a very strong preference was expressed for cash transfers over direct delivery of goods. People really appreciated the autonomy and the flexibility. Although when we first rolled out the cash transfer program, we had a lot of people saying, we're worried about this. We don't think that households will use the money for things that the girls need. We want goods to be distributed directly because we want to make sure that girls get them. What we found shortly after rollout is that in the end, people appreciate having the autonomy and the decision-making power. We found quite interesting results about decision-making and how the money is used. I think we were very pleasantly surprised by the fact that essentially everyone that we consulted with confirmed, number one, the parents tell the girls, who are the intended ultimate beneficiaries, when the money comes in. And across the board, we are finding so far that girls are being consulted about how the money should be spent. So we have an interesting difference between kind of families in Kakuma and families in Dadaab, which are kind of two very different cultural environments. For those who might not know, Dadaab is, I think it's 98% Somali refugees, and in Kakuma, it's mostly South Sudanese, but also Somalis, Ethiopians, Burundians, Eritreans, a more mixed cultural environment. So we had kind of an interesting distinction there. What we're hearing from Kakuma is that for the most part, girls themselves, so these are the adolescent and teenage girls, are the primary decision makers of how the money is being used. And reports that we're hearing from Dadaab are that parents make the final decision, but across the board, girls are being consulted in those decisions, and girls are always told when the cash transfer payment's coming in and consulted. So we had one parent in Kakuma saying, I tell the girl to do a budget, and then I see how much I should add for her. Then I add that and give it to her together with the cash transfer money to go and buy her things. And then we have a parent from Dadaab saying, my daughter and I reach the decision together. I make the decision, but I ask my daughter her needs at that particular time. So we're seeing that what are people actually using this money on? How are the needs being prioritized? So the most common uses that we're finding are things that are very, very direct needs for this population of girls. We're finding girls are purchasing sanitary ware, they're purchasing stationery for school, uniforms, and then family household needs such as food and firewood. So overall, across the focus groups that we conducted, which were kind of a mix of focus groups of parents and a mix of focus groups with girls themselves, separated so that girls could, of course, speak a bit more freely. The funds are generally speaking, of course not in every single household, but generally speaking prioritized with girls' own educational needs at the forefront. Secondly, their siblings' educational needs. So often, younger siblings who needed stationery or needed a uniform, they would be the secondary beneficiary. And then third in line is kind of the other common household needs. So kind of those preliminary results from, as I said, that short pilot phase, when we were kind of still in the process of scaling up and rolling out the program, suggesting for now that around 40% of girls certainly do have improved attendance in school. We're kind of anticipating that number will increase as we're scaling. All the parents consulted felt, generally speaking, that attendance had improved. So the implications for empowerment, as I said, we weren't kind of rolling out a rigorous randomized control trial. This is a very kind of qualitative process. But I think the initial implications for empowerment that we can see is, number one, expansion of financial inclusion to refugee households and to female-headed households who were not at all embanked before this process, many of whom, did not understand how a debit card worked or have access to a bank. We have yet to see kind of a long-term impact on kind of household poverty because this assessment was done relatively early on. So we'll kind of continue to monitor that as it unfolds. I think the most exciting thing for us, especially in the context of a girls' education program, is the shift in household decision-making and the shift towards shared household decision-making. And again, we weren't looking specifically at, wives or female heads of households. We were looking kind of more so at the daughters, at girls themselves, and their inclusion in decision making. And that was really exciting for us. And the further implication for the education program being girls have increased kind of negotiation power within the family. They have more of a stake in family decisions. And this puts girls in a great place to kind of build their own negotiation power and their own negotiation skills for those other conversations of, well, mom and dad, can I go to secondary school? Can I take this vocational training course? It's going to cost some money, but I think it'll work, and here's why. And giving girls more of a stake in that decision. And the fact that, parents and families have been really receptive to that is really exciting for us, and girls being able to build that sense of confidence and leadership. And I have a voice in this family, and it's important to talk about. One of the other interesting pieces is the household chore burden, because this is one of the, alongside poverty, this is one of the other main issues that we see preventing girls from regularly attending school and affects their dropouts. What we have heard at this stage is that there's no significant reported impact on that household chore burden, which is quite interesting. And this is something that we are continuously working on in KEEP. We talked about in our kind of overview of evidence thus far, the importance of complementary interventions. So in a lot of KEEP's other community engagement activities, we are trying to tackle this household chore burden issue in a few other ways. So We have a film that's just coming out that we're kind of screening in the community, and we have discussion groups around that. And the film is focused on household chore burden and the impact of that and proposing solutions. And we have an Engaging Men and Boys program that's all about training our community mobilizers, who are kind of our frontline social workers, you could say, in the community, working with the program. And we're training them on engagement of men and boys, identifying male champions, talking about these issues, asking men to kind of step up in terms of household chore distribution, asking brothers and fathers to step up and help with this issue. So we're doing some complementary work on that, and hopefully we'll see kind of a change on that. But I do think that's quite interesting so far. I mean, I think the household chore burden issue would be more impacted if the amount of the cash transfers potentially was higher, because as I said, we do see this prioritization. People have been given a very clear message of the first priority is education-related expenses, and then we see household spending kind of falls to the third priority. So, you know, it depends how many resources are available, and maybe, you know, depending on the month, there might be more of an impact on that household chore issue. So I think that's it for now on our findings. As I said, you know, these are some preliminary results, and we're really excited to continue to look at the impact as we scale up, as we reach more families, and we'll kind of continuing to support the same families year on. And so the dosage is long-term, and it's kind of deep. And we hope that will kind of help to shift the needle for some of those families, alongside all the complementary initiatives that we'll have through KEEP. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting results from both cases. Very encouraging to see that despite the complexity and the nuance in the impacts on women's empowerment, that you are seeing intended positive results. So that's very encouraging. And I guess actually, Stephanie, you already started hinting to the next question. And this is a very self-serving question coming from an academic, of course. One of the things that we're doing in this series is, in addition to sort of trying to get a sense of, okay, what's the state of the art in terms of the literature, but also what are some of the practical issues around these cases. You know, we'd like to leverage the fact that we have practitioners and academics and policymakers all in this conversation together to help guide us a little bit, academics, on where do you see the future research needs here, right? If there's one thing that you'd really like students in the audience to think about their next, you know, master's or thesis paper, what would it be? Give us a hint of where you think the future research needs are. Stephanie.
Yeah, sure. There are so many interesting areas that we have yet to explore. Of course, I am kind of from the program implementation side of things, so my biggest interests are in all of these operational questions of how can we do cash transfers better, and those implementation debates that you kind of referred to earlier. So I think there, as you've outlined, Sonia, in our first presentation, there is a huge body of evidence around cash transfers. There's a lot that we already know. There isn't as big of a body of evidence on cash transfers, specifically in the context of education programs in either humanitarian contexts, in protracted refugee contexts, or kind of in fragile or emergency contexts. There is some evidence, but not kind of haven't kind of reached that critical mass that enables us, I think, to draw really strong conclusions yet. That's definitely a big area of interest for WUSC. We have this real interest in kind of fragile and conflict-affected contexts, in refugee education and girls' education in refugee contexts. So I think the need there is big. We have some evidence. It's quite interesting. So just one very quick example. Our partner, Charlie Goldsmith Associates, who we work with on the KEEP program to deliver cash transfers, they work in South Sudan and deliver cash transfers at a national level. And their work has shown that there can be huge impacts on girls' attendance, even in very unstable contexts, like in South Sudan. So, for example, there were, roughly speaking, around 940,000 girls attending school in South Sudan in I think that's overall. No, it's girls attending school in South Sudan in 2014, and there's now 1.7 million in 2018. And that is a very large-scale national cash transfer program funded by the British government. So there is some evidence that this can make a huge difference, even in fragile contexts, but I definitely like to see more. Some of the, I think, operational questions or implementation debates that are really interesting for me to explore are what are kind of some of the best ways to tackle that communication issue that's so critical and that so many programs struggle with in terms of communicating why cash transfer programs are structured, how they are, explaining financial inclusion pieces. I think there's also some really interesting questions around the best modalities for delivering. So, the evidence from Malawi that you pointed out, Sonia, shows, the conditionality actually does have an important impact. How can we promote kind of more interoperability of different cash transfer systems so that we're kind of not constantly redesigning the wheel, so that we don't have, as we currently have multiple small cash transfer programs? How can we streamline and make things more efficient there? There are, in sub-Saharan Africa, relatively fewer kind of government or national programs in cash transfers. And yeah, finally, just in conflict context, there is a bit of a debate, I think, about contexts where markets may be limited or where markets are disrupted, and are cash transfers as effective in those markets? And I think that's an interesting area to continue to explore. And that whole space of education in emergencies and humanitarian context, there's a lot more we could learn there.
Okay, thank you very much. Frank, you have 5 minutes.
I'll try to do it. So for me, I think I'd take more of your questions with the context of our research project, which is whether cash transfer to women will lead to more women empowerment. All right. And if you recall, we don't seem to find a statistical effect after 18 to 20 months. All right. So the experiment was to give cash transfer to women with some conditions, observe outcomes after 18 to 20 months, compare the treated versus the control households, and is there a difference in their empowerment? And we don't seem to find a difference, right? And so then the first thing to pause is like, all right, so what does that mean, a significant difference? Is that there has to be a difference in the outcome of both between the treated and the control. And it has to be statistically significant. And what does that mean? And that means it has to be a real difference. And so that the difference is not due to some random event, but it's due to that the treated households are very more empowered than others. And what we're finding is that we seem to be more empowered, but there's not enough of them so that the difference is statistically different from zero. All right, that's what we find. So that's what I mean by recall the meaning of significance is we don't. And why is that? There could be different reasons, right? So one is that we don't have enough observations. We don't have enough households, right? If we had more of one treated households and more of the control households, that would reduce the noise, all right? And we had 1,900 households. Maybe if we had like 5,000, we would have been able to do it. So that's one research issue. We need more in terms of that. The second thing is that what the treatment is cash over 18 months. Is that enough to induce changes in empowerment? Broadly defined, right? So recall that from the baseline, right, we said that most of these things would be not with income per se, but with issues relating to leadership, time use, and resource. Maybe cash is not enough. You need more than that, right? And that's what the qualitative story tells us, right? That's right to do it. So perhaps with more observations and say over 5 years, we wouldn't have been able to detect the difference on by cash alone. But what we're trying to see it is that, using both the quantitative and qualitative methods, right, is that, perhaps more time, but also more likely than not, more than cash is needed. And it has to be different approaches. So cash could be a necessary condition, perhaps, but it's certainly not sufficient, all right? And so their legal structures have to change. At the community level, some things have to change, right? And some of the information or some of the, for instance, the discussions that Stephanie was talking about the role of the program, the types of learning that it's done. For instance, individuals at a community level would give some sessions on women empowerment, would give some sessions on legal structures and so on. They're trying to do it, right? Some of that is perhaps more needed. So if I had more money and if I had, tried to convince IDRC or some other generous foundation, right, I would try to say, look, let's do something similar to this, and let's have different types of treatment and let's different effects at the community level, try to change it. But the real thing is, in terms of research, is how do we change institutions? How do we change stereotypes? How do we change mentalities, right? How do we do it? All right, and how do we do it in one village only? Sometimes it's because of individuals and everything else. Well, how do we do it when we scale up to different villages and different towns, right? How do we that? We need to have a role model at a national level. We need to have guidances from presidents, politicians, or something. A lot of these things we need to know more in order to do this, because empowerment is just not a matter of cash, obviously, and we need to start running some of these things too. And I think the qualitative methods story and how to do it is going to be very, very good to try to do it. But also we need more people from the ground, from the field, people from the NGOs that come in and try to discuss these things and communicate. Not only researchers, but also people from field should work with them so that we understand more. Right? And maybe hopefully do more studies, but certainly understanding more is a good start. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you both, students, researchers. I hope you've been listening, because there's a lot of interesting avenues to pursue, from the operational and implementation debates to particularly looking at very difficult contexts in fragile states, in refugee and humanitarian settings. And donors, I hope you've been listening also. The need to increase the scale also in terms of the number of beneficiaries and control, in terms of expanding programs to be able to also have better data, to be able to maybe flesh out some of these patterns and trends. And of course, these issues, you didn't directly address it here, but you did it more earlier also on the measurement stuff, which is also, I think, in line with both of those. So thank you very much for answering our questions. I think we have just over, we've got about 7 minutes for question and answer. So maybe we'll start with taking some from the audience. Are there any questions here in the room? Are we? Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I'm really interested in something that you mentioned, Stephanie, but Frank, I'm wondering your insights into this as well, as to what are some of the, I don't know, best practices is the right word, but maybe interesting or innovative examples of some of these complementary programs that go along with cash transfers that maybe do have an impact on shifting gender norms or stereotypes or institutions. Stephanie, you mentioned engaging men and boys. I'd love to hear more about that and the community mobilization efforts. Yeah, what are maybe some examples of interesting complementary programming or initiatives that you've come across, both of you?
Thanks for your question. So not with this program, with another program that was done called Power Africa by Care Canada, They actually worked on financial integrations and village savings and loan associations in 4 different countries. They did a very good job at trying to have the agents of the program going into training individuals and then having community leaders training them in gender relations so that communications would be done with the individuals, with the men's, with the women, with the boys and the girls, because some of these programs are for young people. Right? And that was an integrated part, and they had to be delivered, right? And that was part of the program. So when it's explicit like this, that seemed to have worked, right? Now, whether this is replicable in Tanzania, where it's a different question, right? But certainly that's an attempt that one could be done.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think a very important one. There's so many examples of great community engagement work. I think from our experience, what has always been the most effective is investing in local and grassroots community work and finding local champions. I mean, no matter where you go in the world, no matter what small village you're in, you'll find a couple people who really believe strongly in, you know, girls' education or in women's empowerment or whatever other cause that you're working in. And finding those local champions is so critical. So as I mentioned, we work with Windle International Kenya, which is a great Kenyan organization. They've been in the camps for a very long time, and we work really closely with them on the community engagement piece, identifying local champions. Religious leaders can be so important and so influential in engagement. It's really, really critical to get buy-in from religious leaders and from community leaders. So yeah, I mean, very broadly speaking, I think that's a really great start. On the engagement of men and boys, I think there's a couple things that we have been working on. So we work with White Ribbon, which is Canada-based, focused on you know, men and violence against women and prevention and mitigation, obviously. So we work with them on the engagement of men and boys, and really strong focus on, you know, we know there are a lot of men out there who are really care about this issue and are really invested, but don't really know what to do. And that's kind of the sweet spot. And it's all about finding ways to help those men kind of speak up and gain a bit more confidence to participate in kind of bystander intervention. If they see or hear something, you know, empowering them to, you know, they know in their hearts it's not right, but they don't know what to say or how to say it, and focusing on empowering them to speak up against those issues.
Thank you both. Oh.
Relating to your first question, as it's surely very important to have these complementary activities, towards achieving more impact, not just transferring cash. Is in your experience, did you have some financial adequacy, let's say training? You mentioned training, Frank mentioned training, you mentioned the also engagement in the community and engaging other leaders, even like religious leaders. So very like a professional development training and financial adequacy training, and training for boys and men, engaging them actively in the same on the same topic, you know, like gender related topic.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think if we were doing things all over again, we would have a bit more of a structured approach to financial literacy. As I think I said in my response to the first question, we knew it would be a challenge, but I think we did slightly underestimate the scope of the challenge. What we have done in terms of financial literacy is we're kind of developing materials, easy to understand, like graphic materials, to help explain some of these concepts, and relying on our absolutely fantastic network of kind of community mobilizers and community leaders to help communicate some of that messaging to communities. I think, you know, as I said, we're an education project, not a financial literacy project. So there is always that challenge of kind of mission creep and lack of resources to do everything that you want to do. But I think a training program is important, and something relatively small scale, like for example, a radio show about financial literacy concepts or something like that can go some way and make a small difference on shifting that needle.
Okay, well, thank you. We've come to the end of the seminar. So I'd like to thank everybody, first our panelists for providing some really, really, really interesting material based on specific cases. I'd like to thank the audience here in Ottawa at IDRC and the audience online as well. And of course, I'd like to thank IDRC and Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for helping fund this series. And maybe Kate can just wrap up with 30 seconds to tell us what's next in this series.
Great. So we do have 3 to 4, the list keeps growing, more seminars coming up in this series. We'll be taking a break over the summer. I know people, especially those who work in international development, tend to sometimes leave for weeks or months at a time. So we've decided our next seminar will take place in September. We have 2 coming up. One's going to be on the topic of social norms, and the other will be on qualitative research methods. So we don't have exact dates for those yet. We're still working with our facilitators to determine their schedule. But if you go to our website, women'sempowerment.lab.mcgill.ca, you can find information on those future seminars, as well as all of the PowerPoints and suggested readings and recordings of our past seminars. So this seminar, if I'm good at my job next week, should be up by the end of next week for anyone who wants to be able to send it to friends or to review certain parts. It should be up by next Friday. Thank you.
Many thanks to Kate for making sure all of this happens and so wonderfully. Thank you. All right, so see everybody. Have a wonderful summer.